4 of Gonzaga's 5 starting spots are basically set in stone, but Mark Few has 4 options to fill that final spot, and we're going to break them all down on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Well, folks, the overview for today's show is quite simple. Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, and Graham Ike are going to start for the Gonzaga Bulldogs next season. There is very, very little doubt about that. However, the 5th and final spot in Gonzaga's starting lineup could go a handful of different directions, and we're going to talk about 4 of those options on today's show. We'll start with Ben Gregg. We'll talk about Khalif Battle in the second segment. We'll close out the show talking about Dusty Stromer and Steele Venters and any other potential starting lineup options or maneuvers that Mark Few and the coaching staff could make. That's the show plan today. We'll get you out. We'll get you into your weekend. We'll get back to it next week. We're starting with the returner, the guy who started in the second half of last year. 2 of these 4 guys technically started games last year for Gonzaga, but we're going to start with the big fella, Ben Gregg. We're going to talk about his numbers, his performance last year. We're also going to talk pros and cons. And I want to say with Ben Gregg is the only starting option for Gonzaga, assuming the other starting 4, where Michael Ajayi is playing the 3. In any other lineup, if Battle's the starter, if Venters is the starter, if Stromer is the starter, Michael Ajayi will be playing the 4. So because this role with Ben starting also directly impacts Ajayi, we're kind of going to talk about both of them in this segment. Let's start statistically with Gregg. Last year, Ben averaged 9 points, 5.7 boards, just over 1 assist and 1 steal per game. He shot an absurdly, comically, video game level 73.3% on 2-point shots, as well as 37.5% from 3. It's important distinction here to break up Ben's season into 2 parts: when he was a starter and when he was a reserve, especially in the context of having a conversation about whether he should be a starter or a reserve next season. Last year as a starter, Ben averaged just over 10 points a game, 6.5 rebounds, 1.7 assists, 1.3 steals, shot 78% on 2-pointers, which is absurd. I said video game numbers. It is that level of production, 78% on 2-pointers. He also shot 40% from 3. So as a starter last year, Ben Gregg averaged 10 and 6 with elite levels of production, 78% from 2, 40% from 3. As a reserve, Ben played less, obviously, as you would expect. He still averaged 7.5 points, about 5 boards, about half an assist, a little more steals, 1.3 compared to 1.2. He's shot 67.5% on 2s, which is still absurdly good, and yet 10 percentage points lower than he shot as a starter. He was also 33% from 3, so he took a pretty big climb in efficiency as a starter as well. The pros for Ben Gregg are pretty obvious. He's already started in the system. He is exceptionally familiar with playing alongside Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman and Graham Ike. Mark Few did not like having multiple new starters at key positions last year. It slowed the team's development down. It took them a while to get that cohesion and that connectedness that we saw in the second half of last year. I believe Mark Few wants to eliminate as much of that as possible this season, and a very effective way to do that is to make sure your starting lineup is comprised of players who are familiar with your system and familiar with each other. In that regard, Ben Gregg is the best option for Gonzaga as the 5th and final starter in this lineup. He is also a player that deserves to be rewarded. In an era where not a lot of players are doing this, Ben Gregg stayed at Gonzaga. He developed gradually through the system, saw his role increase year by year, last year culminating in spending half the season in the starting lineup. He has earned the opportunity to be a full-year starter for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. And in fact, seeing Mark Few do the opposite, seeing Mark Few not start Ben Gregg as a senior, play him less than he did in his junior year, would be very out of character. Mark Few has historically rewarded seniors for being in the system for as long as they have. He's rewarded seniors with additional playing time. This is commonplace. Obviously, Khalif Battle is a senior. Steele Venters is a senior. But those are not guys who have put in the amount of work in Gonzaga's system as Ben Gregg has. Additionally, a starting lineup with Ben Gregg gives Gonzaga an obscene amount of size. Ben Gregg starts at the 4, Graham Ike starts at the 5, Michael Ajayi starts at the 3. As we mentioned, every other lineup has Michael Ajayi playing a small ball 4 role, much like Corey Kispert did as a senior, a little bit like Julian Strother did, although he spent a lot of his minutes at the 3 just because of the presence of Anton Watson for that team. But regardless, this would be the lineup where Ajayi would be playing the 3. Very few teams are going to be able to handle a lineup that has 2 guys 6'10" and above in Ike and Gregg, and 1 guy at 6'7" or above in Michael Ajayi. Very few WCC teams are going to have a really hard time with that size. Even non-WCC teams outside the conference are going to struggle with that level of size, especially because while this team has size, they also still have floor spacing. A lot of teams that have a bunch of big players starting at the same time, things can get kind of bundled up. You're going to have issues with floor spacing. You're going to have a lot of guys like Graham Ike is not going to get the room to operate. But this team, Michael Ajayi shot 40+% from 3 last year as a starter last year. So did Ben Gregg. So you have 2 guys who are big, who are very good rebounders. Ajayi averaged 10 a game last year. Gregg's a great rebounder for his size. You have 2 guys who are elite rebounders and elite 3-point shooters. They can space the floor, give Graham room to operate, terrorize teams on the glass, on the offensive glass and on the defensive glass. And yes, they're going to be a little bit slower, but they can still move well in this lineup. And I think they're going to create so many mismatches for opposing teams trying to figure out how to defend them that it's going to be well worth the few downsides that there would be. Which, among those downsides, not being able to get out in transition is a big one. And that's not to say that this lineup would be incapable of getting out in transition. Michael Ajayi is a very athletic player. Him playing the 3 does not limit Gonzaga in terms of being able to get out. But Gregg and Ike are not, they're not guys who fly up and down the floor. They're just not. That's not the players that they are. They are half-court offense types. And having 2 of those guys in your starting lineup probably results in a lot of situations where you see Ryan Nembhard get a pass or get a long rebound and turn to get out in transition and have to slow it down as soon as he gets past half court, because there's just not an opportunity to actually go get down the court and get in transition. Doesn't mean they won't do it at all. It just means it'll be limited. Won't be as often. I do think the bigger issue with this lineup for Gonzaga would be defensively. One of either Michael Ajayi or Ben Gregg are consistently playing defense away from the rim. Last year that worked because Anton Watson could play power forward and small forward and defend away from the perimeter. We don't really know if Michael Ajayi can do that. I think he's capable of being a defender, a perimeter defender. I don't think it's like out of the question that he's capable of doing that, but he's not going to be Anton Watson. That is less of an insult to Ajayi, more of a compliment to the fact that Anton Watson was one of the best perimeter and overall versatile defenders in all of college basketball last year. Losing him is a huge loss for Gonzaga on both ends of the floor, but very particularly on defense. And a lineup with Gregg and Ajayi is probably going to be limited against certain lineups who have a lot of guards who can attack the basket, who can attack off the dribble. I think it could limit Gonzaga. I think they could be challenged in the pick and roll, depending on matchups and things like that. So I think this lineup could challenge Gonzaga defensively while providing a ton of size, a ton of floor spacing, a ton of experience too. You'd have all seniors starting in this lineup here if you have Gregg starting alongside Ajayi. So a very good, versatile, and I think the projected, if I were guessing right now, I would have Ben Gregg as the 5th and final starter in this lineup, but certainly not the only option. And that's what I want to talk about now. Gregg is the returner. Gregg gives Gonzaga that big jumbo lineup that they love, but starting Khalif Battle gives the Zags an electric, fast-paced offense, and frankly, that might be the move. We're going to get more into that in just a second. Right after a word from today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, patience, that's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Plus, with over 122 million parts to choose from for your ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every single time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking Gonzaga's 5th and final starting spot for the 2024-25 season. We are projecting Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman start in the backcourt. We're projecting Graham Ike to start at the center. We're projecting Michael Ajayi to start at either the 4 or the 3. And then we are trying to finalize that 5th spot for Gonzaga's starting lineup. We talked Ben Gregg in the first segment. He'd play the 4. Ajayi would play the 3. Now we're going to talk about the potential 3-guard starting lineup for Gonzaga next year. Khalif Battle, transfer from Arkansas. What if he starts alongside Nembhard and Hickman in that backcourt, pushes Michael Ajayi to the 4, and Graham stays at the 5. We're going to talk about what that lineup would look like. First, a bit of information about Khalif Battle for those who need a refresher, who are mixing up all of the newcomers for Gonzaga. Khalif Battle has played 101 career games in his college basketball career. He started 32 of them, so he is very familiar being a sixth-man type coming off the bench. Played 24 games at Butler in the 2019-20 season. Played 45 games at Temple across 3 seasons. Started about half of them. 19 total starts in those 3 seasons. Last year played at Arkansas, all 32 games for the Razorbacks. Started 13 of them. He's a career 13.3 points per game scorer. About 3.5 boards, 1.5 assists, 35% from 3. Last year at Arkansas, that's pretty much what he did for the Razorbacks. He was a little better scoring-wise, 14.8 points a game for the Hogs, 3.3 boards, 1.3 assists, and exactly 35.3% his career numbers from the three-point line. The pros and cons for Khalif Battle are sort of the inverse of what we saw with Ben Gregg in a lot of ways. The pros are that this lineup can fly. This lineup gets up and down the floor like nobody's business. You like those run and gun, high profile, 90-plus point per game offenses? This lineup is what does it. Nolan Hickman and Nembhard, can get up and down the floor. We know that. Now you add in Khalif Battle. He's a 6'5" hell-raising guard, super high-level athlete, loves to get out in transition, scores around the rim with reckless abandon. You move Michael Ajayi to the 4. We know he's capable of playing at that spot. He averaged 10 rebounds per game last year for Pepperdine. He is a solid three-point shooter. He can space the floor at the 4 position, but he's strong enough to go down and play closer to the block if the Zags need him to. Even in Gonzaga's offense, it's not like they have a power forward and a center both posted up on the block at the same time. They do occasionally, but they also do the high-low situation. So Ajayi would be able to play the 4, still be able to be away from the rim and attack off the dribble if you wanted to, or be able to hit those open shots. Adding Khalif Battle into the mix puts tremendous rim pressure on the opposing team. Khalif Battle made more free throws last year than anybody on Gonzaga attempted. He loves to get to the basket. He loves to draw contact, get to the charity stripe, convert from the free throw line. Adding him to the starting lineup puts a ton of pressure on opposing defenses. They can't leave him alone, but in an offense that also features, a potential All-American caliber center in Graham Ike, a guy who averaged 18 a game last year in Ajayi, and 2 very strong scoring guards in Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. Battle is going to need a lot of attention from opposing defenses to not let him go crazy, but they're not going to necessarily be able to give him that attention. And if he's getting the ball and the opportunity to go downhill to take his man one-on-one off the dribble, or getting in switches where he can go at bigger guys, he's going to do that. And he's going to do that a lot, and he's going to do that very well. So having him in the starting lineup gives you a team that can more quickly get out in transition, that can put more pressure on opposing defenses by putting the ball on the deck and getting to the basket. That's not a strength of Ben Gregg's. He obviously has other strengths, as we talked about, but that's not in particular one of them. So I think this lineup is smaller, is more athletic, a little bit more versatile potentially, and is going to put more pressure on opposing defenses. I'd also acknowledge that while Khalif Battle is a guard, he is 6'5", and he's built kind of like a linebacker. So it's not, I don't think this lineup would create a situation where Gonzaga would be too small. Khalif Battle is built more like Malachi Smith. And it never felt like Malachi Smith was too small to play in 3-guard lineups with Gonzaga. Joel Ajayi is another good example in that regard. Joel was not very big. He was a 2-guard, but he played the 3 in a lot of Gonzaga lineups, and it worked fine because he was a fantastic rebounder, which was a really helpful skill for him to have. Battle's not that level of rebounder, but I think that with Ajayi and Graham Ike in the front court, you're going to be fine from a rebounding perspective. But especially against WCC teams, Battle's size does not concern me at the 3 position. The cons for Khalif Battle as a starter are the rebounding. We talked about that already. We talked about how Joel played that role for that 2020-21 Gonzaga team that went all the way to the national championship. But Joel was one of the best rebounding guards in the country, one of the best Gonzaga has ever had. Khalif Battle's not that. He's a career 3.2 rebounds per game type guy. He's never really been somebody who grabs a lot of rebounds. His career high, I think, was at Temple, and it was like not even 4, I don't think. So he's just not a rebounder. He's not a rebounder. He doesn't aggressively pursue going after the basketball in that way. I still think because Michael Ajayi is a capable rebounder, a guy who did it really well last year at Pepperdine in the WCC, we know Graham Ike is a tenacious rebounder. And again, it's not like this lineup is permanent 40 minutes a game. You're going to have Ben come in. You're going to have Braden come in. You're going to have other lineups that work in this situation. So I think for Khalif Battle, his lack of rebounding isn't going to be a big problem. The other things that I think are more likely to come up in the con area here, it puts Michael Ajayi in a tougher defensive position. Michael Ajayi is now going to have to defend bigger players against certain teams. In the WCC, a 6'7" power forward is going to be fine. He's going to be fine. There are not a lot of teams that are really going to give him a lot of trouble. Like Joshua Jefferson, if he was still at St. Mary's, that might have been an issue for Gonzaga, but guess what? He's not there anymore. So it's not somebody that is as big of a concern. And there's other teams in the conference that are going to have 2 6'8", 6'9", 6'10" guys, and some of them might be a challenge for Ajayi to guard. And in those games, maybe that's a situation where Ben plays a little bit more and the guards play a little bit less, and you kind of just rotate guys in and out. But I think by and large, Ajayi's defense is a huge hinge in either direction. If he's really struggles to defend away from the perimeter or away from the rim on the perimeter, that could create situations where the Ben Gregg, Michael Ajayi pairing doesn't work as well defensively. Whereas on the flip side, if Ajayi is getting bullied by bigger guys, you may not be feeling as comfortable having him spend the majority of his minutes at the 4, in which case the 3-guard lineup with Battle might be more of an issue. Ajayi is going to play the 4. There's just no doubt about it because Nembhard and Hickman are going to play a bunch of minutes, and you also need minutes for Steele Venters, for Dusty Stromer, and for Khalif Battle. In those situations, Ajayi is either off the floor or he's playing the 4. So he's going to play the 4. It's going to happen. But how he does defensively against some of those bigger 4s is going to determine how much he can play down the stretch. If he starts getting in foul trouble against those types of bigs, that creates a problem for Gonzaga, where they're probably going to end up having to sit him and have a lot of lineups with 3 guards and Ben Gregg at the 4, and then Graham Ike or Braden Huff at the 5. The nice thing is this team has just oodles and oodles of depth so that they can withstand foul trouble. They can withstand defensive mismatches. They can withstand some of those problems that could come up with any of these lineups and just make alterations and adjustments. Another con that I think would probably be the biggest hurdle for Mark Few, I don't think he wants 2 newcomers in the starting lineup. You start Battle and Ajayi, you have 2 key positions where you have somebody who is new. They're new to the system. They're new to the offense. They're also kind of playing a new role. Battle has not been a starter for most of his career. It's not to say he's incapable of starting. Of course he's capable of starting, but it is a newer role for him. So you're asking him to play a new role on a new team. You're asking Michael Ajayi to potentially play a new role depending on kind of where he flexes out in this offense and with a new team. Mark Few did not like having to do that last year with the new center and new point guard and multiple new players at new spots. Watson taking on a new role, Hickman taking on a new role, Dusty Stromer was new. Like they didn't like having all of that. And this year's team is clearly going to have less of that. But I think Mark Few wants to eliminate as much of it as possible. And starting Khalif Battle creates another wrinkle where you now have 2 players in new spots and 3 returning starters. Whereas if you start Ben Gregg or even Dusty Stromer or kind of Steele Venters, you are returning 4 starters or 4 players and only have 1 newcomer. I think the combination of the fact that Mark Few does not want to play multiple new starters next year and the fact that Khalif Battle has made a career out of being a microwave scorer coming off the bench sort of gives me a feeling that Battle, unless he just completely outplays Ben, or it just is a much, much more fluid lineup in practices and scrimmages, I think ultimately Battle is going to come off the bench. I think that's what he was brought here to do. I think that's the role he's comfortable with. I think Ben has earned that starting role. And I think that's my likely projected starting lineup. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's coming down to Ben Gregg or Khalif Battle. Those guys could both be coming off the bench next year. Dusty started 15 games as a freshman. Steele Venters was recruited to this team to be a starter. There's very little doubt in my mind that they brought him here with the intention of starting him for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. So neither of these players can be counted out for that final spot. We're going to talk about both of them in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports. We all love sports. That's why we're listening to Sports Podcast. And I never, ever want them to stop. But the playoffs have wound down. We just got MLB, WNBA right now. Olympics are coming up. So generally, the sports are not sporting the way that we want them to. However, FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime that I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody every day, all summer long. We're talking Olympic basketball. If you want to support Coach Mark Few, watch the Olympics with a vested interest. Currently, Team USA has minus 550 odds to take home the gold medal. If you're feeling like, hey, we saw what we needed to see from Kelly Olynyk, Andrew Nembhard, and Team Canada, I think they got a chance to take down that Team USA and win the gold medal. They are at plus 1,100 odds right now. I believe France is at plus 1,600. They come in third if you're interested in that as well. Either way, head to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still talking Gonzaga's final starting spot for the 24-25 season. Once again, as a recap, Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, Graham Ike. We expect with near 100% certainty that those 4 players will start for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. In the first segment, we talked about that 5th spot going to Ben Gregg, shifting Michael Ajayi to the 3. The second segment, we talked about newcomer from Arkansas, Khalif Battle, taking that final starting spot, playing the 3 and shifting Michael up to the 4. Now to close out the show, we're going to talk about 2 other wing options for Gonzaga in Dusty Stromer and Steele Venters. Once again, both these players would start at the 3, pushing Michael Ajayi into that starting power forward role. Let's start with Steele Venters. Steele did not play last year with an ACL injury suffered 2 days before Gonzaga's season opener against Yale on November 10th. He sat out the entire season. It pushed Dusty Stromer into a starting role, which we will talk about momentarily. Reportedly, Steele Venters is on track right now. He's not at 100%, but the most recent updates we've had were earlier this month, thanks to the great reporting from Theo Lawson at the Spokesman Review, that Steele is recovering well. He's doing non-contact stuff. He's kind of getting to the point where he should be able to do scrimmages and full 5-on-5 stuff before the start of the season, hopefully with enough time to be at the point where he is at 100% for the start of the season. The injury is an important part of this conversation. If Steele's not at 100%, the frankly not super high odds that he ends up as a day one starter go down even more. If he's not 100%, he's not starting. If he's at 80%, he's probably contributing. He's maybe getting brought along a little bit slowly, but he's not starting. I'm not sure he starts even if he's at 100%. We are going to talk about what that case would look like. Steele Venters in his final season at Eastern Washington in 22-23 averaged 15 points, 2.5 boards, 1.5 assists, shot 37% from 3. The year prior to that, he was the Big Sky Player of the Year, averaging 16.7 points, 43.5% from 3. He was the Player of the Year in that conference that also featured Dalton Connect, who just went to Tennessee and became an All-American and was the 17th overall pick by the Los Angeles Lakers in the NBA draft. The pros for starting Steele Venters is you immediately give your starting lineup a floor spacer, an elite three-point shooter, and a solid backdoor cutter. Steele Venters does not need the ball in his hands to be an effective and impactful offensive player for Gonzaga. When you are looking at identifying your 5th starter, that is often something you want in that player. You cannot have 5 starting players who are all ball dominant, who need a bunch of touches every possession. That doesn't work. In fact, if going back to the Olympics, this current Olympic roster for Team USA is more balanced, but they've had issues in the past where they've had like Carmelo Anthony and Kevin Durant and LeBron James and a bunch of players, Derrick Rose, who need the ball in their hands, and the lineups didn't work. They didn't mesh very well because of that. When Gonzaga is looking at their 5th and final starting spot, ideally you want somebody who can get to their spots, who moves well without the basketball, who doesn't hold on to the ball very long, who's not just sitting there dribbling around a lot. You want somebody who's catch and shoot, who moves well without the ball, and who doesn't take up a lot of ball energy, I guess is the best way to put it. Steele Venters fits that to a T. He's a movement shooter. You get him the basketball in a spot where he's open, he's going to shoot it. You get him the ball in a spot where he's not open, or he's just running the motion offense, he's going to get rid of the ball. He's not going to turn it over a bunch. He's not going to hold on to the ball, dribble a lot, waste time like that. He's going to shoot, or he's going to get rid of the basketball. He also moves really well without the ball. We saw that even in the brief time that we did get to see him in a Gonzaga uniform in the scrimmage game. He had a really nice backdoor cut for an easy lay-in. Defenders are going to have to come out on him defensively. If they don't, he's just going to shoot over him and he's going to knock a bunch of shots down. He's 40+% three-point shooter for a reason. If defenders are out on him closely, he can make backdoor cuts to the rim, get open looks that way. And if defenders are out on him, that gives Graham Ike more room to operate. That gives Braden Huff more room to operate. Ben Gregg. That gives Khalif Battle more room to put the ball on the deck and drive to the hoop. Michael Ajayi, same thing. Steele Venters' his presence, just because of his elite three-point shooting, his presence alters opposing defenses in a way that is an overall net positive for Gonzaga on the basketball court. The cons for Steele Venters, he's not a very good defender. We haven't seen him in a Gonzaga uniform as a defensive player, so we're kind of just extrapolating that based on what his defensive metrics and data were at Eastern Washington. But I think it's fair when looking at the comparison of him versus Ben versus Khalif versus Dusty, he's probably the weakest defender of the group. And him and Michael Ajayi both being perimeter, I guess Ajayi would be defending more on the block, depending on the lineup the team was playing, could be problematic. Nolan Hickman and Ryan Nembhard are decent defenders, but they're small. So you have two small guards, a relatively weak wing defender, Ajayi defending perhaps a little out of position. It's just not a great defensive lineup. And I think it works in situations. I think there are specific lineups that work very well with Steele Venters in them. I'm not sure starting is the right option for him. I think he's better served as a dead-eye shooter coming off the bench. You bring him in certain situations. You force the opposing defense to change. If any defense tries a zone against Gonzaga, Steele's the first player you bring in instantly in that situation, force them to either let him shoot over the zone, which is a bad idea, or get out of the zone in that situation. I think he's more of a situational, rotational player as opposed to a starter, just because of his unique skill set and some of the deficiencies that he has in his game. Closing out with Dusty Stromer. Dusty started 15 games for Gonzaga last year, played 35 total, so 20 of them coming off the bench. Again, he started because of that injury to Steele Venters. Was not expected to be a starter for Gonzaga last year. It just kind of had to step into that role on the fly. As a starter, Dusty averaged 6 points, 4 boards, 1.5 assists, shot 39% on two-pointers and just 32% from three. As a reserve, his numbers all dropped because he played less minutes. Not a surprise there. Still averaged about 4 points and 2.5 boards. He was about 41% on two-pointers, so his efficiency as a two-point scorer was basically exactly the same. But his three-point percentage, which was 32% as a starter, bumped all the way up to 41% as a reserve. I don't think that's a coincidence. I also don't think it's entirely related to him switching from the starting lineup to the bench. I think it is a combination of just getting more comfortable with his role, getting more comfortable being a catch and shoot corner three-point specialist, not trying to do too much offensively, just settling into a role as a very good perimeter defender, as an energy guy, and as a corner three-point shooting specialist. He settled into that role comfortably, and that role could work in the starting lineup. It's similar to Steele Venters, with the notable exception of Dusty being a much better defensive player and Steele being a more consistent three-point shooter. It's not quite the same, but there are some similarities. Another pro for Dusty is he has familiarity. He started 15 games last year. He's played with everybody in that starting lineup except for Michael Ajayi. We talked about not wanting there to be multiple newcomers in the starting lineup. We didn't really mention that as a con for Venters because he's more familiar, because he's been in practices, and I think he'd be more comfortable. The learning curve wouldn't be as sharp for Steele as it would be for Battle. But certainly it's even less so for Dusty, who's already started games for this Gonzaga roster. He's already started alongside those two guards. So Dusty doesn't need the ball in his hands to be effective, similar to Steele Venters. He's comfortable with the role that he would fill on this team on both ends of the floor. He's a very plus wing defender, and I think he takes defensive pressure off of Michael Ajayi, off of Nolan Hickman, because he can contribute in that area. His defense in particular, I think, is the biggest pro in terms of having Dusty Stromer in the starting lineup. The cons would be just that the offensive game is just underdeveloped. Steele's role is something he's really comfortable with, and we kind of expect that he'll be able to handle consistently. Dusty, the jury's still out on that. Doesn't mean he can't get there. Doesn't mean the upside's not higher. Just that he's not as comfortable with his offensive role in a Gonzaga lineup, and you'd rather have, when you have options who are more experienced and more comfortable with their roles, you're going to go that direction. I also think Dusty might thrive in a situation where he's given a little bit more freedom coming off the bench, where he's with the second unit, where maybe he's not as restricted offensively. It kind of depends on how he's used and the substitution patterns. And I'm very curious about that because, as you've likely learned from this show, I am projecting both Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer to come off the bench next year. So I'm very curious whether they play a lot of minutes together, whether they kind of stagger the minutes. Those guys are both not on the floor at the same time. I think there's a lot of intrigue in how Dusty Stromer is utilized this year, how often he plays, what the lineups look like, if he is given more offensive freedom, if he's not given more offensive freedom, which we've seen with players like Dom Harris and Hunter Salas in the past, where they didn't get opportunities to really shine offensively. Dusty hasn't proven that he needs those opportunities yet, but if he starts to, how does he get utilized? How does that kind of work within Gonzaga's system and within the amount of talent that they have on this roster? Quickly talk about the other scholarship players on Gonzaga's roster who we did not list as potential starting lineups options for Gonzaga. The most notable player that we didn't talk about is very clearly Braden Huff. He is the best player that didn't get mentioned here, and that's very simple. They're not going to start Braden Huff and Graham Ike. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't make sense. It makes sense for Braden Huff to be the backup to Graham Ike, to spend the majority of his minutes playing when Graham Ike is not on the floor. I think Braden and Graham may spend some time together. I think it is an option that they could explore and utilize, especially with Braden's floor spacing ability. I think it can work. But there's no reason to start them both at the same time. Braden Huff is very talented. He's more talented than some of the guys on this list, but he's not going to start for Gonzaga next year. Emmanuel Inocente fits the role more because he's a 6'5" guard. He can play the wing. He could fit into that starting lineup. He's not good enough. I mean, frankly, he's just not good enough to be a starter for this team, not over the options that Gonzaga already has. He's also not even with the team right now. He's with the Italian U20 team. He's not going to have as much experience working with the team, learning the system, understanding the offense. He's a player who's going to play very little next year and is not a candidate to start. Ismaila Diane is kind of a combination of both those two things. Not only is he not experienced enough to start, and he only just now joined the team in Spokane, but he's also not a fit positionally to be a starter for this team. So he's out. And then the last option is Jun-Suk Yeo. Obviously, he has more experience in the system. He's been with Gonzaga for a couple of years now. He played at times decent minutes last year. He's a bit of a fit positionally. He could play the 4 and shift Ajayi to the 3 or vice versa. But simply enough, Yeo is not, he's too raw. He's not developmentally ready. I'm not even sure if the upside talent-wise that Yeo has is on the same level of a Ben Gregg or a Khalif Battle or even Venters or Stromer. I think Yeo does have some upside and some untapped potential, but there's no logical reason for him to start. And again, somewhat similar to Inocente, I'm not sure I even see much of a consistent role for Yeo this upcoming season. That's going to wrap it up for me today and for this week here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much. To those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, have a fantastic July weekend here. Hopefully it's not too hot where you are at. We're going to be back next week, continuing our summer league coverage, continuing to talk about recruiting, talk about this Gonzaga starting lineup, and we'll, of course, keep you up to date on Olympic coverage as well. Thanks again for listening, and folks, until next time, as always, go Zags.